Today's video is about the importance of rhythm, and I was inspired to do it by a post I saw on Facebook that actually left me a little bit heartbroken for the person concerned. So let me tell you that story because it's really important, and I know a lot of people are actually going through the same thing. So what happened was that this person had done something that a lot of us do. They were clearly a beginner player and had fallen in love with a piece of music that was very complex and had done an amazing job of actually learning that piece of music note for note, quite a large portion of the music, and they had uploaded a video of themselves playing it to Facebook to get some feedback and to celebrate their achievement, because honestly it was hundreds and hundreds of notes, it memorised in precisely the correct order, but unfortunately it sounded really quite bad because the rhythm was all over the place. And the comment section wasn't particularly kind. It wasn't that people were being deliberately cruel, it's just that they were giving straightforward advice. You need to find a teacher, you need to look at the rhythm. And judging from this person's reactions to those comments, they were really heartbroken themselves that they had put so much work into this and they were expecting to get some positive feedback, and unfortunately really none of the feedback was positive. So they had made two major errors in learning the piece of music. The first one that I've talked about in other places, which was playing a piece of music that is far too advanced for you when you're in the early stages of learning piano. It's a very common thing for people to do, but it pretty much never gives a good result. But the other thing was another really common error that people make as they're learning piano, and that is not paying attention to rhythm. So if this person had uploaded a video where the rhythm was correct and a lot of the notes were wrong, they actually would have gotten much more positive feedback because the music would have been recognisable, and for people who aren't maybe familiar with the piece of music in particular, they may not have noticed the wrong notes. But because the rhythm was very hit and miss, the entire piece was distorted and almost unrecognisable. So as I said, my heart really broke a little bit for this person, and it must be very traumatising, and I really hope they don't give up piano on the back of this. And a lot of people do quit because of this very reason. They take on something far too difficult for them and it goes wrong, and then they decide they're no good at piano and they give up. In order for you not to take that route, I want to do a video today talking about the most common rhythm errors that I see people making and how you might correct them. Because rhythm is absolutely fundamental to music. You can get away with lots of wrong notes, but if your rhythm isn't spot on, if it's not precise, even the most unmusical ear among us will pick up that there's something wrong with what you're playing. So let's jump in and go through some of the most common rhythm errors that I see students making. The first one is the most all-encompassing and probably the most common of all among beginner students, and that is just completely ignoring the rhythm. You know it's there, you know you should be reading it, but you're concentrating so much on the notes, and that's difficult enough, and getting your fingers to do what you want them to do, so you just leave out the rhythm and you hope that you'll get it by ear. And that kind of works in the beginning because a lot of the pieces that you're playing are fairly simple. You can listen to them once or twice if your teacher plays them for you, or you hear them on YouTube and you're able to reproduce that rhythm. But once you reach a stage where you've gone slightly beyond elementary level, things start to get a little bit more complex, and if you haven't got your rhythm nailed down at that point, you're going to start running into difficulties. And the reason people tend to ignore reading rhythm at first is very understandable. It really is quite daunting. It's like learning maths. So it does feel easier to just take a shortcut and hope that you'll catch up later. Now I have a video that I'll link to at the end of this video that'll go through the basics of rhythm with you and give you some easy ways of getting on top of your rhythm from the very get-go. Because I know that the traditional way of teaching rhythm in music lessons isn't always the easiest, so there are definitely some easier ways of doing it. So do check out that video after this one if you're serious about music and serious about getting to grips with rhythm. The good news though is that while at the beginning we may look at rhythm and think, oh, this is way too much, I'm never going to get the hang of this, they're like infinite combinations of rhythm. In fact, there's only a very small number of basic building blocks, and it's the way we combine those that gives rise to all the different varieties of rhythm. But once you have those basic building blocks, it becomes very easy then to combine them or to understand how a piece of music combines them, and you can work out even the most complex rhythms with time and practice. So the biggest piece of advice I can give you is whatever stage of piano learning you're at, start tackling rhythm head on straight away, because it's really going to give you the most bang for your buck in terms of improvements in your musicality. So with that big one out of the way, let's start looking at the more specific rhythm errors that people make. Adding or subtracting beats is something I see all the time. Usually what happens is when you're counting metrically in a piece of music, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, you're counting along and your eye falls on a bar line and your brain stops. It's like there's a barrier before the next bar starts. So what happens is we get to 1, 2, 3, 4 and we stop for a second and then we continue 1, 2, 3, 4. So we're adding an extra beat there without even realizing it. It's also very common if you're playing something in 3/4 time, that something that should go 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, that last note in the bar becomes lengthened and it becomes 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So an extra beat gets in. When I'm teaching this to kids, I call it the sneaky 4, and they have to watch and make sure that the sneaky 4 doesn't slip in. You can also find yourself subtracting beats by just not holding a longer note for the length that it's supposed to have. So it's sometimes a question of holding your nerve. If you've got a bar of music that has a whole note in it, you should hold it for 1, 2, 3, 4, but that feels like an eternity to you because your brain is playing tricks on you and you end up going 1, 2, get to the next bar. So the solution to this is to not count 4 beats in a bar or 3 beats in a bar, but to count each note individually. So if you have a bar with 4 quarter notes in it, instead of counting 1, 2, 3, 4, you can count 1, 1, 1, 1. And that way you don't have to reset back to 1 at the end of every bar. In 3/4 time, if you have a bar with a half note and a quarter note, then you can go 1, 2, 1, 1, 2, 1. And that helps you to establish a really strong sense of how to count each note value. Later on, you can go back to counting metrically. It's really quite necessary for more complex rhythms, but in the early stages, you can use rhythm language or you can count each note individually. Let's have a look at an example. So here's a piece by Bella Bartok called Dialogue, and the first line of it goes like this. But what frequently happens is, because we're trying to count 3 in a bar, or we've got that bar line that acts as a barrier to the next bar, what happens is we often play Do you see what happened? 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Because I'm at the end of each bar, and now I'm looking at the bar line, I'm resetting to 1 and I'm trying to get back to 1 and start again, and that note gets held for too long. So if you're trying to count 3 in a bar, that can add too much of a mental burden to combine with reading the notes and everything else. So you can make it easier by just counting each individual note like this. 1, 2, 1, 1, 2, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. And that makes it just a little bit easier to keep going. Another very, very common error I see is when people play music and fail to differentiate between different note values. So the rhythm in music is really very precise. It's quite mathematical in the way notes relate to each other. So for example, a half note is exactly half of a whole note. A quarter note is exactly a quarter of a whole note. An eighth note is exactly half of a quarter note. But what can often happen is we're looking at a piece of music and we're focused so intently on what the notes are that we actually don't notice any difference between the different kinds of notes at all, and everything turns into the same beat all the way through. And here's an example of that. This is a piece called The Elephant Parade by Nicky Isles. And in it we have a combination of eighth notes, quarter notes, half notes, tied notes. A lot of things are going on. So it's very simple for it to turn into this. So every note sounded exactly the same length. But in fact, what we have are eighth notes, quarter notes, and then longer notes, quarter notes, and eighth notes again, etc. So what we end up with is really an absence of rhythmic variety. The quickest way to get this idea across is a little exercise I often do with younger students, where I play exactly the same notes twice, and you've probably seen me do this before in other places, but I vary the rhythm the second time. So here are the notes that I play. So that's just a scale of C descending, isn't it? And every note is exactly the same length. I'm going to play exactly the same notes again, but this time I'm going to vary the rhythm. So you see immediately what a huge difference rhythmic variety makes to a piece. The same notes played twice, unrecognisable from each other because of the change in rhythm. Our next problem is related to our first overarching error of just ignoring rhythm completely, but it's actually a little bit different. So this is when you're guessing rhythms instead of actually counting them precisely. So in this scenario, you're looking at a piece of music and you're noticing that you have different note values. For example, you may have a lot of quarter notes and then suddenly you have a run of eighth notes or 16th notes. But rather than actually count those precisely and notice how they relate to the other notes around them, you just go, okay, so these notes are faster, so I'm just going to play them faster. And what that results in is often very uneven rhythms, or rhythms that just aren't correct. So for example, if you have a run of 16th notes, you play them faster, but you end up playing them like 8th notes. So instead of just playing notes faster and hoping for the best, it really is very, very important to work out the relationship between these different kinds of notes and be very, very precise and mathematical about how you apply that. This sounds very daunting at first, all this maths and working out of stuff, but actually you'll find the more you do it, the quicker it'll become really second nature. It just makes sense. And as I said before, it's not an infinite number of varieties. It is really just the same kinds of notes relating to each other in different ways. And once you've got the hang of the basics, you'll be able to combine them in every imaginable variation without any difficulty. Let's have a look at an example of that. This is a piece called The Shepherd's Song by Simone Play. And here's the opening phrase. So you can see that we have a lot of different kinds of notes in this. We have half notes, quarter notes, 16th notes, 8th notes. And so this is a pretty typical place where people will come along, they'll start playing and it'll be fine. And they'll see, okay, I've got these faster notes here, so I'm just going to play them faster. And continuing, oh, I've got some 8th notes here, so they played faster as well, so I'll just play those faster. So as you can see, that distorts the rhythm. You can see from the way I've marked up the sheet music here for a student that I was working with, I have really broken it down quite mathematically, because these notes need to relate to each other very, very precisely for the rhythm to be correct. 1E and 2E and 3E and 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 that. Don't panic if that sounds like something you think you'll never be able to do. You absolutely will. It just takes a little bit of practice and looking at examples. The next problem is where the brain plays a trick on us, and this arises when you're learning a piece of music that is mostly okay, you're able to play most of it, but there's one or two sections in it that are really challenging, and that because they're more difficult, you find yourself slowing down to play those. But as you play the piece of music, as you learn it, that difference in speed never goes away. So what's happening is your brain is filling in the gaps. So your brain knows what the music is supposed to sound like, and it's telling you in some form that, yeah, that's pretty much what you're doing. It's fine. We get the idea. Well, you don't realise, of course, that somebody listening to this isn't sharing that insight that your own brain has into what this music is about, and they're hearing you play fast, then slow, then fast, then slow. So watch out for that. The best way to discover if you're doing it is to record yourself, and you'll notice straight away if something isn't working. And that section that is played slow will need to be really worked on in isolation to bring it up to the same speed as the music around it. And you'll need to work on transitioning into it and out of it rhythmically. So counting the rhythm from the easy bars that lead into it and the bars that lead back out of it into the more easy section following. So this is a place where using your metronome is actually going to help you establish that beat, that steadiness that goes all the way through. And the last really common error is just looking at your music and not noticing that there are rests here and there and completely ignoring them, just going straight over the rest onto the next note and forgetting about it. Let's have a look at an example of that. So I'm just playing the right hand of this écossais in E flat. The left hand would actually fill in the rest, making it less likely that this mistake will be made. But often what happens when somebody plays this with the right hand alone, they forget to look for the rests, and we end up with something that sounds like this. And it really is just because sometimes our eye isn't fully trained to notice the rests in between. So what you can do to remedy that is to literally just say rest at the places where it is there. That'll train you to actually acknowledge them. So you can go like this. Rest. 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 And gradually you get better at including them in your counting, because they are very much part of the rhythm, not an optional extra. So all of these problems are very, very fixable. They just take time and effort and the willingness to be uncomfortable for a while. When you start off doing anything, you're going to be pretty bad at it. But the more you do, the better you get. And this is very true of reading rhythm in music. But please do take this seriously, because music is rhythm. And professional musicians are first and foremost living rhythm machines. That's the biggest difference between an amateur and a professional. The rhythm will be absolutely spot on, precise every time. There is no question about it. It's not up for negotiation. If you play music and you occasionally hit some wrong notes, but your rhythm is always precise, you're still a musician. But if you play music, all your notes are perfectly correct every time, but your rhythm isn't precise, well, you'll become a musician eventually if you keep working at it, but you may not be quite there yet. And that's the difference. So really, rhythm should be your absolute first concern. So your first step can be to watch that video that I mentioned earlier on, that's linked at the end of this video. But if you want to take your understanding of rhythm to the next level, you can find a full course on rhythm over in my membership at Lekela Music over at the website, and I'll link to that below. You can even do a 7-day free trial and watch the whole thing for free. I don't mind one bit, but whatever you do, don't ignore rhythm reading while you're learning music. And if you do that, you'll reap the benefits for years to come. So I hope you do. I'll talk to you again soon. In the meantime, happy practicing.